Our next guest can drive a stick shift as well. He used to be a mayor, now he's the secretary for the Department of Transportation. Please welcome Pete Buttigieg.
Evening.
Okay, we're not going to ask you if you can drive a stick shift because that's just too tough. I can't, so we're not going to ask you. But
3 hours of driver's ed. That's where it began and ended for me.
We are both Michiganders. I don't live there anymore. You do live in Michigan now. I know that Michigan is a big Delta hub. And today you announced that you're investigating Delta for what happened over this last several days. Are you taking Delta on the way home?
I did take Delta a few days ago. What is going on is unacceptable. Everybody was impacted, or just about every airline was impacted on Friday. But the question is, how quickly can an airline recover? All of the other airlines recovered within a day or two. That has not been the case for Delta. Even today, hundreds of flights have been canceled. Overall, more than 5,000. We estimate more than 500,000 passengers have been impacted. So we are investigating both how the breakdown happened and what's going on with customer service. Because when there is a problem, you got to be able to get a hold of somebody in a reasonable amount of time. We're hearing a lot of indications that that's not happening either. So we're fielding a lot of complaints. We're preparing the investigation and obviously pressing Delta to meet their obligations to passengers.
To compensate passengers, this is something that you've really pressed for, is this idea that people aren't getting the compensation that they deserve when they're wronged by the airlines.
A couple things are especially important. One is 2 years ago, we secured enforceable commitments from all of the major airlines, including Delta, about what they would do in a situation like this. And this means they have an obligation, again, an enforceable obligation that we can follow up on to take care of things like ground transportation and hotels, meals, rebooking. But also, it is now the case that every passenger should be secure in getting a cash refund, unless they prefer something else. And we're making cash refunds the default in a situation where you get canceled and you don't get rebooked. I reminded Delta of that responsibility too.
This came up earlier this evening in one of our other conversations, but President Trump just a few days ago attacked this idea of EV mandates but others have pointed out we don't really have mandates per se, but clearly the administration has pursued EV adoption. And EV adoption has been, I think, slower than anticipated. How do you feel about where we are today and what needs to be done, if anything, to accelerate that transition?
Well, what we know is that every year more Americans buy EVs than the year prior. And there are really two things we're doing to facilitate that process. One is to make them cheaper. That's what the tax credit is all about. The other is to make sure that you can find a charger when you need one. Even though 80% of EV charging happens at home, it remains very important for those whose homes don't have a garage or a easy way to plug in a car, and for those longer use cases, those longer trips, that we have the kind of EV charging network that would be consistent with that. Look, it took us 100 years to get the network of gas stations we have today. We just don't have that long for EV charging network.
Okay, so let's talk about that. The EV charging network, just short of 200,000 publicly available chargers today. We know that most people charge at home, but they need the confidence that they can charge while they're on the road. You've got this big infrastructure plan to invest in EV charging throughout the country, but critics say it's not moving fast enough. Where do you stand, and are you comfortable with the pace that it's rolling out?
It is moving fast enough to meet the president's goal, and I think we're actually going to come out ahead of the president's goal of having 500,000 chargers across the country by the end of this decade. Just since Joe Biden took office, the number of publicly available chargers has nearly doubled. It's at 188,000. That has been driven by the private sector. Now we're going to begin coming in with federal dollars to help fill in some of those gaps, respond in some of those places where it is not yet profitable for the private sector. The bulk of those chargers will be installed in 26, 27, and 28, but the first handful of them are already going into the ground and will soon be in use.
Is this just a matter of deciding where they need to be, and that's just difficult because the blocking and tackling of actually picking locations is hard?
That's part of it, but a lot of it is what goes into developing a site for a charger, especially these fast-charging, high-capacity chargers. It's not just like the thing you hook up in your garage. It requires procurement, site work. We're talking about, again, doing in a matter of a handful of years what took decades to build up in terms of America's network of gas stations. And it's not the same as gas stations. They don't belong in the same places precisely because, unlike gas, a lot of the fueling of electric vehicles, the majority of it will happen at homes and workplaces. And yet, we can't leave it only to homes and workplaces and expect to have the equitable and widely available network that America needs.
I think a lot of people would say that you have your finger on the pulse of sort of Midwestern culture. You're from Indiana, now you live in Michigan. But there is some cultural concern that some people are moving away from EVs. It's becoming politicized. How concerned are you that EVs will become too politicized, that it affects the transition?
Look, I think it's frustrating anytime something that should be totally non-political somehow gets an ideological valence. I would have said and would say the same thing about public health and vaccinations. There should be nothing ideological about that, and yet it became almost a partisan thing with really disturbing results in terms of some prediction that your political party could be a predictor of whether you were protected from something like COVID. I think it's a little more scrambled in the case of EVs. I think the reason ultimately will not be a barrier for the long term is that there are so many benefits to having one. So you don't have to be a Democrat or a Republican to want to save money. And now that we have reached the point where the data show that for an equivalent model between an EV and a gas model, you're now pretty much the same price, maybe even a little better on the EV. For the rest of the time you own it, you're definitely saving because it's cheaper to charge than it is to fuel up with gas or diesel, and there's less maintenance on these. That means over time that there's a clear savings. As long as that remains true, then people would have to, we're getting pretty close to where people would have to choose to pay extra. Just the way the market dynamics are working. We're not making them pay extra, just to be clear. Sure. But we're getting into a situation where you'd have to just be really, really committed to these more dirty and expensive fuels in order to continue choosing vehicles that use them, especially as the EV technology gets cheaper and cheaper.
But you do have to make some compromises, at least now, to drive an EV. You have to at least plan your trip. If you're planning to go more than a few hundred miles, you need to be more strategic about it. In that cultural barrier, it seems like a lot of people just want to believe that they can drive across the country at any given moment. And that's where you come in. You have to get those chargers in place, right?
Yeah, and we're recognizing this is not an overnight transition. Our expectation and goal is that about half of new vehicle sales be EV by the end of this decade. We don't have the grid or the charging network to accommodate some kind of overnight switch. We're not driving one. We're definitely not mandating one. And we're not expecting one. For some people, it'll be the right answer to have a hybrid. That's actually what our family has. Our family minivan is a plug-in hybrid. It's electric for the first 30 or 40 miles, which
Pacifica?
Gets us, Pacifica, yeah, gets us to daycare, gets us to Target. But if we gotta, if I gotta drive the dog between DC and Michigan, the gas engine kicks in. So people will figure out the right answer for them. What we are doing is making it more affordable for those who choose to move in that direction.
So you don't feel like you lost your cool factor buying the minivan or anything like that?
No, I very much do, yes. But you swear you're never going to be a van person, and then you become a dad.
Hey, a few years ago, Kia introduced a minivan. They called it a multi-purpose vehicle, so you can use that if you want. Okay. When we talk about EV adoption, if price is a huge barrier for some people, and the president just recently announced 100% tariffs on EVs coming from China. And if, we need people to buy EVs and at the same time need to fight climate change, should we just embrace cheap EVs coming from China?
No, because it's not fair competition. We're talking about I can't even call it industrial policy. It's really a market distortion policy driven by China. By the way, not because the Chinese Communist Party is populated by environment buffs, right? I mean, they're doing this because it is strategic, because they understand the strategic value of trying to dominate the EV market, because the EV market is where the entire automotive sector is going. This is why it really harmed our economic security when the Trump administration all but deliberately gave China the advantage in the EV market. And now we are working to reclaim it onto American soil. And this is really personal for me, precisely because I grew up in the industrial Midwest. I grew up not realizing it was unusual to have acres of collapsing factory buildings on either side of the road when you went to school until I left to go to college. And having seen firsthand what can happen, not just to a company, but to a community, when industry fails to keep with the times and fails to innovate, we have got to make sure that as the industry shifts to EVs, it's an America-made EV revolution. That's been a big focus for President Biden.
I mean, yeah, I have family in Flint, Michigan, and in Janesville, Wisconsin, people who have seen what's happened when auto factories have shut down. But we know that Apple, for example, designs the iPhone here, doesn't make it here, and no one seems to have an issue with that. But cars are different?
Yeah. And again, we're talking about, we're not just talking about the fact that there's different costs to different factors of production. We are talking about a manipulation of the market by China, which is why the president has stood strong with trade measures to protect that domestic industry.
Let's pivot quickly to autonomous vehicles and self-driving cars. The Department of Transportation has been investigating Tesla for several years over the autopilot technology and why they call it autopilot. Is Tesla promising more than they can deliver?
Well, I am concerned when I hear some of this language that's being thrown around in marketing materials. Just to be super clear, the driver, any car you can buy today, I don't care how fancy the cruise control or anything else that it's called is, if you can buy it today, then it is a vehicle that requires you to be fully engaged in the driving task. These are driver assistance systems, not driver replacement systems. And I'm concerned about anything that leads people to believe otherwise. By the way, I'm really bullish on the safety potential of these automating technologies. But precisely because they stand theoretically to save so many lives, we have to be very thorough and responsible about having that technology unfold safely. And just from a regulatory perspective, foreseeable misuse of a feature is enough to make that feature considered to be defective.
What's your relationship like with Elon Musk? Do you hear from him? Do you talk to him?
I mean, he doesn't call very often, but yeah, I've met him. I visited their facility in Texas and had a long conversation with him. Then I remember early on having a meeting with all of the OEMs where he committed, he kind of in passing said that he was going to open the supercharger network, and I wasn't sure whether to take that seriously or not. Later on, that's exactly what happened, and he knows that I appreciate that. So look, ultimately, there are lots of different stories, styles, and personalities in the automotive sector. Our concern is just to make sure that we don't pick winners and losers. We want these companies to, we want their mode of success to be delivering excellent, well-designed, safe, clean, preferably made in America vehicles.
What about the Cybertruck? You going to drive that?
It's got too many angles for my taste, but that's just a matter of taste.
All right, we probably only have a minute
also,
or two
I'm not trying
here.
to afford one. But.
Well, I understand. All right, we only have a minute or two. Okay, we have to ask you, news of the moment, probably everybody's waiting for this. There's a lot of talk about the Veep stakes right now. Are you interested at all?
For better or for worse, as long as I'm wearing this suit talking about DOT stuff, I cannot talk about campaigns and elections.
See, I kind of thought you'd say something like that. Okay. All right, well, let's end on one fun thing. How did you get here today? You were across the street. Did you scooter? Did you walk? Like, how does a transportation secretary get from door to door?
Yeah, I just walked. Yeah, nothing too dramatic about that.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you to all of you. We have until about 8 o'clock here, so you can mill about. We appreciate you coming to Axios. Please subscribe to Axios AM, Axios PM, my newsletter, Axios Closer. And thank you again. Please a round of applause for Secretary Buttigieg.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean.